And now, on with the show.
My name is Derek M. Cook. The podcast is called Monster Kid Radio, and the song is Hearse Surfin' from the Phantomatics, from their album She Left Her Brain at the Drive-In, appearing in this episode of Monster Kid Radio by permission of the Phantomatics. This is episode number 9, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's episodes of the podcast where we celebrate the classic and sometimes not so classic genre cinema of yesteryear. But there is no doubt this time around, this week's movie is a definite, hands-down classic. We're going to be talking about the 1958 film, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. This is the first of 3 weeks of Ray Harryhausen coverage here on Monster Kid Radio. And these episodes were recorded earlier this year before the great man passed. And I decided to play these episodes before I found out that our friends over at the B-Movie Cast are actually doing their own tribute series to Ray Harryhausen as well. In fact, the episode of the B-Movie Cast that just played this past Sunday features the same guy who's guest hosting on this week's Monster Kid Radio episodes. And that would be writer, author, designer, artist, game designer, Stephen D. Sullivan. Now, you can find out more about what he's up to over at his own website at StephenDSullivan.com. And that's Stephen with a PH. Go check that out. And back in May, he posted an article on his website. He called it The Children of Ray Harryhausen. And it is one of the most moving, touching tributes to the man's work that I've read online since Ray Harryhausen passed on. So I recommend you guys go check that out. I think the combination of what Stephen has to say in these episodes of Monster Kid Radio and then what he says over at his website, it makes it pretty clear the influence that the man had on, well, all of us, really. I don't think any of us could claim to be monster kids if it wasn't for the work of Ray Harryhausen. We're going to get to that here in a second. First, I want to go over our contact information like we always do here at Monster Kid Radio. You can find us at monsterkidradio.net. Our email address is monsterkidradio@gmail.com. And our voicemail line is 503-479-5MKR. Now, I would like to do a feedback-specific episode at some point down the line here at Monster Kid Radio, but it's been brought up over on our Facebook page that, you know, it's still a new show. People haven't quite figured out the routine, the flow, and a lot of conversations that you would normally have with a podcast, you're actually seeing happen over in the Facebook group. So go look up Monster Kid Radio in Facebook, join the group, please like the page, and let me know what you think of the show or have a conversation with some of the other listeners over there. I do want to give a huge thanks to 2 people who have left reviews in the iTunes store. They're calling themselves Bobby's Monkey and Cinema Slave Joe. I really appreciate the feedback and the reviews in the iTunes store. Now, we can't even get an average rating in the iTunes store until we get what they're calling enough ratings. So I don't know what that means. I don't know what enough is, 5, 10, whatever it is. But if you do listen to the show through iTunes, if you wouldn't mind, please head on over there. Let us know what you think. Let everybody know what you think, because the more reviews we get, the more listeners we get, the bigger the community gets. And I know we're a young show, but I feel so positive about the people that I have interacted with online about the show. I love what I'm doing here with Monster Kid Radio. I'm having a blast. I hope you guys are digging it too. We've also received a ton of support from various bands and musicians who have allowed us to use their music on our show. So I really appreciate all the musicians that have appeared on the show so far, and a big shout out this week to the Phantomatics. You're going to be hearing that song that I played at the beginning of the show, Hearse Surfin'. You'll hear that in its entirety at the end of this episode of Monster Kid Radio. And then in the next episode that comes out in a couple of days, you'll hear another song from their album, She Left Her Brain at the Drive-In. If you want to hear their music for yourself, go to thephantomatics.bandcamp.com. That's Phantom as in Phantom of the Opera, Maddox.bandcamp.com. You can find a link to them in the show notes of this episode of Monster Kid Radio. And we'll get to the rest of the episode right after this.
Do you enjoy movies like Carnival of Souls, The Mole People, Black Sunday, and The Tingler? Do you find yourself late at night reading magazines such as Film Max, Chiller Theater, or Monster Bash? Do you love vintage television programs like Sky King, Outer Limits, and The Time Tunnel? Do you find yourself surfing the net looking for the next monster movie festival or expo? Do you enjoy hearing anecdotes, cinematic details, and unusual insights into some of your favorite movies? If you answered yes to any of the above, you are encouraged to join your host, Vince Rotolo, as he examines some of the latest horror, sci-fi, and cult theatrical releases, new DVDs to add to your collection, and of course, the old classics, both good and bad. He even interviews people throughout B-Moviedom. So tune into B-Movie-Cast at bmoviecast.com.
From the land beyond, from the world past hope and fear, I bid you, Stephen D. Sullivan, now appear.
I obey the master of the lamb.
Welcome, Stephen D. Sullivan, to Monster Kid Radio. How's it going, Steve?
It's going really well. How's it going with you?
I'm doing good. And I'm eager to talk about a movie that is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse with you. We're going to be talking about The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad from 1958, full of Ray Harryhausen goodness.
Oh, totally brimming with Ray Harryhausen goodness. Dynamation in color.
That's right. This is the first Dynamation film, right?
It is the first official Dynamation film. And I was reading about that actually this morning. I thought I'll brush up a little bit since though this is my favorite film. You know, there's some facts you carry in your head and some you don't. Mm-hmm. And apparently they felt at the time that they needed a word to describe the animation, the stop motion animation that Harryhausen was doing. That wasn't just animation, because when you said animation in the marketplace, people thought of Mickey Mouse.
Right.
So they came up with the idea of Dynamation, which combined the word Dyna, which was from something I think Charles Schneer had in his car. It was a Dynaglide car or something with the animation, so it became Dynamation, and this is the first one,
right,
which they claimed that process.
Now, this wasn't necessarily the first Harryhausen film or even the first film featuring this stop-motion technique. I mean, that goes all the way back to King Kong.
Right.
Willis O'Brien, right?
Right, yeah. Stop motion even goes back way before that with O'Brien doing The Lost World and other things, and the experimental films he did and other animators did back in the 1910s and 1920s.
Mm-hmm. And O'Brien influenced Harryhausen, and Harryhausen worked with him on a film?
Yeah, he actually worked with Willis O'Brien. Willis was the head technician, and Ray was like his direct assistant, and actually did, from what I understand, did most of the animation of Mighty Joe Young, of Joe Young himself. And you can actually see that. Once you become familiar with Harryhausen's films, there's kind of character that puppets have, and a way that they move, and certain things that they do, and you can see some of that in Mighty Joe Young. You can see how that's different in a way from the way Kong moves, even though they're very similar characters.
Excellent. Now, I do want to talk about the movie and talk about Harryhausen, but first, Stephen D. Sullivan, who are you?
Who am I? I am an artist and a game designer and comic book writer, and I have been working professionally in the industry since 1980, when I joined the staff of TSR, which was TSR Games, TSR Hobbies at various points, but then just TSR, the creators of Dungeons and Dragons. So in 1980, I went to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin to work in the game design and development. I was in production, which was the equivalent of editing, on the version of Dungeons and Dragons that became known as Moldvay Cook, as well as Top Secret and Boot Hill, and a lot of the other TSR role-playing games at the time. And
knowing that you were involved in some early D&D work, I can definitely see the appeal to a movie like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. I mean, you've got the skeletons, you've got the monsters, you've got all this stuff. Did any of that influence you as a game designer?
Absolutely. This film, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, is one of the key films in influencing my life. It's right up there with, I was to rattle off my top 5, it would be Casablanca, King Kong, The Seven Samurai, Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and Metropolis, in more or less that order.
Wow.
So this one's right up there for me, and Seventh Voyage has everything that I look for in a film. It has, a lot of us who are writers and do these kind of brain work were, shall we say, not entirely healthy kids. So I was a kid with asthma, a kid that wasn't very athletic, a kid that if I wanted to spend a lot of time outdoors, I would end up gasping and having allergy attacks and that kind of stuff, which got a little better as I got older. But a lot of my life was an interior life as a child. So that involved books, and that involved comics, and that involved movies a lot. And, I remember one of the first movies I saw was a James Bond movie back in 1963. It was From Russia with Love. And somehow, I don't know, movies just really hit it for me as a kid. And at the time, there were these wonderful Aurora monster models, and I had those as a kid. And then somewhere fairly early in the late 60s or early 70s, I got hooked in with Famous Monsters of Filmland, and I started seeing films like this film, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, on television. And then it was all over. That was my life.
So, and I just recently rewatched this. I had seen it years ago, and, I mentioned at the top of this that it's not necessarily in my wheelhouse. I'm more of the monster, horror, sci-fi kind of guy. This is more of a fantasy adventure type movie. I had seen it before years ago and just kind of filed it away in my brain. Rewatched it again, actually just this morning, before we started recording,
cool.
And I watched it on TV. So, my experience is on the screen. Have you ever seen this on the big screen?
I have. I'm just old enough. I'm 53 now, and I'm just old enough that when I was a teenager was kind of the golden age of revival movie houses.
Aha.
In the Boston area, and in Boston there was a movie in Cambridge that did revival movies, and I believe I saw it there, and I believe I saw it again when I moved to the Midwest, came out to Lake Geneva. There was a movie theater that's still there called the Oriental in Milwaukee, and it's a glorious movie palace. Inside it's got Buddhas, and it's got all these kind of Oriental trappings. It's still existent, and when we moved out here, it was showing a new double feature revival every day of the week.
Wow.
So you could go up there on Monday and see two Kurosawa films, and then on Tuesday you could go see two Harryhausen films, and on Wednesday you could go see Bogart films. And they had like a 3-month schedule that we would pin on our walls at TSR and circle these things that we would drive the hour up to Milwaukee to see. And I've seen Seventh Voyage on the big screen a couple of times because of that.
Has it held up for you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it still has. I watched it fairly recently on, as you know, there's a whole bunch of podcasts that we both love, and one of them is the B-Movie Cast. And at some point, we were doing a Yahoo Group B-Movie Cast simul-watch. So within the past 6 months, I watched it again on Blu-ray this time on the screen and gone through it. And yeah, it totally holds up for me. In fact, I was saying to my wife last night, I was talking about this, that I wish there were more of these straight kind of fantasy sword and sorcery movies. Yeah, that weren't just based on classic novels like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and Narnia. Things that are kind of original and unique to the movies. And there just aren't that many. There have never been that many. And that's why a lot of us became fans of Harryhausen, because you knew if you went to see a Ray Harryhausen movie, you were going to see something you'd never seen before.
Right. Now, Sinbad, though, is a classic character from, folklore and legend. I mean, this is not the first time we've ever seen Sinbad as a film, even. He's had some film appearances before this.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, Sinbad goes way back, but you're right. I mean, there are some things in this movie that are just fresh and brand new that Harryhausen brought to the table that you just don't see or didn't see anywhere else.
Right, yeah. No one had made the kind of movie that he made with monsters. And in fact, I hadn't even realized until I was reading one of his books about this, that this is actually the first film of his that has more than one monster in it. Previously, we'd had The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, we'd have the Emir, we had the giant octopus, that kind of stuff. But there wasn't the Cyclops and the dragon. There wasn't more than one model. And aside from King Kong, even Mighty Joe Young only has one creature in it. It's got the ape.
That's true.
King Kong, which, if you'll remember, is even higher on my list than this, has creatures interacting, as does The Lost World. But for Harryhausen, this was a breakthrough, both in terms of the number of creatures he was doing and the type of film he was doing.
Well, and you said interacting there, and I think that's one of the things that struck me about this movie when I just watched it this morning was the interaction between Sinbad and the skeleton, which has become an iconic thing now in a lot of Harryhausen's films, as you see, the humans fighting the stop-motion skeletons, swordplay going on, and it's fantastic. You see, the dragon on the screen at the same time as Sinbad, and I mean, the interaction seemed pretty seamless to me.
It's amazing. It looks really good today. But today people tend to take it for granted because we have CGI and we have the ability to do almost anything. And you have to remember that this film is essentially one guy, Harryhausen, manipulating these things by himself with maybe a lighting technician or someone else like that. But he's essentially doing all this stuff himself in ways that, yes, Willis O'Brien was doing it, and sadly, Willis O'Brien didn't have a great career. He did King Kong, one of the best movies of all time, but then he was like a prophet before his time. He couldn't get people to listen to him. So between him and Harryhausen, there's pretty much nothing. And then it's just Ray, this one guy in the studio, making this magic happen, knowing the techniques that he's learned from Willis O'Brien and developed on his own. And I like to say that people that don't kind of appreciate this, when you go in and you see a Star Wars movie or The Hobbit, and you get to the credits, and there's a credit special effects roll, and the roll goes on and on and on, and there's hundreds of people on that special effects roll, and sometimes it can take 5 minutes to see all the people that worked on the movie. When you go to a Ray Harryhausen movie, when you go to Seventh Voyage, or you go to Jason and the Argonauts, or Valley of Guanji, or any of these, there's one name that replaces all of those people. This was a guy working alone, performing screen magic.
It's pretty impressive. It's pretty amazing. I mean, even a movie like, the Tim Burton stuff, the Frankenweenie, Nightmare Before Christmas, I mean, that's all hand manipulated, but there's a huge crew of people working on these things. Harryhausen was one guy.
Right. No detriment to the guys doing the Frankenweenie Nightmare.
No, not at all.
They're great stuff, and there is a lead technician that does most of that stuff. But up until the last film he did, The Clash of the Titans, Harryhausen didn't have people helping him. Yes, he had people that helped with getting the lighting right sometimes, and he had people that helped with building the armatures for the puppets. And so his dad actually built the armatures for a lot of his puppets. So he had other people behind the scenes, but in terms of putting the stuff on the film, it was him. Yeah,
the real sweat came from Harryhausen. The blood, sweat, and tears was Harryhausen all the way. You can definitely tell there's a consistency to the quality as well throughout this film and then his other films. And I want to mention Clash of the Titans later because that's the one that I saw on the big screen. Mm-hmm. And that one had a profound effect on me, but in a slightly different way. And we'll talk about that here in a bit.
Sure.
We have danced around this movie and what's in the movie just real briefly. The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad picks up right at the end of, I guess, of the Sixth Voyage. Sinbad and his crew are tired. They're lost. They're trying to get home. They find this island. And like within the first 10, 15 minutes, there's a Cyclops on the screen. You don't have to wait for the magic in this thing.
Right, and that's one of the wonderful things about Harryhausen's movies is that in a lot of other films, the monsters they're in the shadows for a lot of the film, and you don't get to see them a lot. In a Harryhausen film, the monster is going to come right out the center stage, and in this case, in glorious full color for the first time, and boom, there it is. You can see it, and it's like, whoa, I've never seen this before. And we should point out that the Sixth Voyage of Sinbad doesn't exist. It's not.
Oh, yeah.
That there are no actual, even though this is called the Seventh Voyage, there are no voyages 1 to 3, at least not on film.
Right.
So we're picking right up in the middle of adventure. They get to the island, they see the Cyclops, they discover the magician and the magic lamp,
mm-hmm.
and then they're away from the island. So
right.
I'll let you continue talking about anything else you want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty short. It's a short lead up to what we're going to see here. It's immediately a magical film because of the Cyclops, which looks amazing. And we pick up our magician, who right from the get-go we know is a bad guy. So let's talk about the cast real quick because we're kind of talking about the characters here. Sinbad is played by Kerwin Matthews, who I thought did a passable job. I mean, he's not the star of the movie. I mean, Harryhausen's work is, but...
Oh, I think Kerwin Matthews is terrific, and I think that's the fact that he is so good is one of the reasons he ended up in a number of other fantasy films,
mm-hmm.
Including Jack the Giant Killer and The Three Worlds of Gulliver, again with Harryhausen, and a number of films like that. You maybe can appreciate it in this, and if you see Three Worlds of Gulliver, which is Harryhausen's next film, which he starred in again, Matthews had a real talent for making you believe that he's in the scene with these monsters, which are not actually in the scene, of course.
Sure.
So he's totally convincing that he's looking at a 6-inch high princess and then, the 18-foot high Cyclops. He totally sells it. So maybe not, a great movie star in terms of, we're not going to talk about him in terms with Bette Davis and Humphrey Bogart or something like that. But in terms of this kind of stuff, he's great.
Oh, yeah. He definitely has that kind of swashbuckler kind of cut to him.
Mm-hmm.
Totally believe that he spent a lot of time on a boat and can command men. He's got the charisma. He's good with a sword. I totally bought that.
Right. He looks reasonably athletic. He's not Steve Reeves' muscle man by any means, but it's actually more believable that he's not a muscle man.
Mm-hmm.
He looks like a guy that's been on a boat.
With a crew that trusts him, and he trusts his crew, which becomes an issue later in this movie when he doesn't have that same crew with him when he has to go back out to the island.
Right.
Now, we also have his princess, Parissa. Did I say that correctly?
Parissa,
yeah. Played by Catherine Grant. And I don't want to harsh on the movie too much, but really, we watched this movie for the monsters. The rest of the story is nice. If you're looking at just the story of the people, I don't know if I bought their charisma, their connection very well. Later in the movie, we learn that it's kind of sort of a political thing as well, which isn't delved into much. But I don't know. What was your thought on their relationship?
We have to realize that again that this is the end of the 1950s.
Yeah.
That these are white people playing Arabs.
That's true.
To start with, so there you kind of lose a level of verisimilitude there, and also that it's a 1950s kids film. Well, it's a film for kids and adults, but we're going to have more of a cliche romantic relationship rather than something that seems more real and believable.
Right. And I bring that up because if somebody hasn't seen this movie and they are going to it for the first time, I just want to be aware that it is a family-friendly film. It's dealing with all these things kind of under the surface. There's the political thing about the two countries coming together. There's this romantic relationship, but we don't get too deep into it because we don't need to.
Right.
So, you've got the lovers here, the relationship, I guess they're engaged. And the other guy that I want to mention, Juran Thatcher as Sakura the Magician, he stole every scene he was in. He's loved awesome. He's a great villain.
He is.
He just looks great.
Juran Thatcher was a fabulous artist, and of course I'm going to completely forget what else he's been in, but he's a guy that had a lot of classical training, a very powerful voice, and a very powerful carriage, and he's just terrific as the evil magician.
Oh, he's fantastic.
Yeah, you totally buy it, and sometimes you think, as you're watching it, can't these other people see that what a schmuck he is?
Yeah. There's that moment when the two kings or whatever the equivalent of royalty is over there are asking him to predict the future, and you can just see on his face plainly, I'm going to play these guys and get what I want.
Right.
You can just tell, but that goes to everything's very surface level here in terms of the complexity of the relationships and the performances, because really it is a family-friendly movie. We don't want to go too far over everybody's heads.
Right.
But man, he's so good.
There's not a lot of subtext to this movie.
No.
Everyone is pretty much what they seem to be, and the hero is very heroic, and the villain is very villainous, and there's not a lot of gray area in the film. And
exactly.
the same as with the romantic relationship and that kind of stuff.
That said, and you mentioned a second ago, these are white people playing, Arab. I was impressed, and I don't know, maybe I'm looking at it as a guy watching this movie in 2013, but I was impressed that they didn't completely anglicize everything. Instead of saying, thank God this or praise God that, it was always Allah.
Right.
And I thought that was respectful.
And I agree. White people playing people of other colors, it's just something you have to accept in the movies from the time, from, like the start of the movies up until at least the 70s.
Well, even now with Johnny Depp playing Tonto here soon.
Right.
So, I mean, it happens.
That just flashed into my head, too. It was like, what are they thinking? I love Johnny Depp. But ironically, Tonto was played by Jay Silverheels, which is one of the only actual American Indian actors.
Right.
So suddenly the only part that was never played by a white guy is now being played by a white guy. What you going to do? It's Hollywood.
Yeah, that's it. It's Hollywood.
But yeah, they did treat the material with a lot of respect, and in some sense more respect than some of the previous Hollywood Arabian Nights epics had. One of the the reasons they had trouble starting this film was Son of Sinbad, which I don't know if you've ever seen. I think it's got, I'm going to say it's Vincent Price is in it and John Hall maybe.
Oh, wow.
But that's just off the top of my head. It's kind of a dopey Arabian Nights fantasy. I think it was produced by Howard Hughes, so it had a fairly good pedigree, and it completely bombed at the box office. It was kind of, in tone, it was more like, I don't want to say it exactly an Abbott and Costello picture, but it was kind of that picture. And this one, on the other hand, it's being played very straight and very respectful, and clearly has a deep love of the mythology, even despite the fact that these are all Anglos playing non-Anglos, has a deep love of the mythology and the background that goes with these stories.
Mm-hmm. So when the sailors show up on this island, the magician needs help because the Cyclops is rampaging. They get on Sinbad's boat and go away. They go back to Baghdad. Well, now the magician wants to go back.
Because they've lost his magic lamp.
Exactly. Now, that's the other thing I wanted to mention is that there is a magic lamp. I had forgotten there was a genie in this thing.
There is. He's a very strange little genie.
Yes. I sat down to watch it. I'm like, oh yeah. There's a magic lamp. And then the princess goes, oh, yeah, I remember that now. But I had totally, that was the last thing on my mind when I came back to this. And you had mentioned, maybe doing this for Monster Kid Radio. The genie was played by Richard Eyre. Did I pronounce that right?
I think so. I've never heard it, so I can't say for sure. The other thing I remember him from is The Invisible Boy. He's the title character in The Invisible Boy. Yeah,
he did a lot of that type of storytelling, a lot of the family-friendly type stuff. Did some Lassie, things like that. So he
has a very distinctive voice.
Yes, he does.
And clearly he's a pretty good kid actor.
Yeah, he is. He does. He's probably the whitest of them all.
Right.
Like, oh, shucks, Sinbad. I just waited for that, oh, shucks, kind of moment. But
I brought it over for you.
Yeah, I know, right?
Right.
His accent does slip a little bit. Everybody else has a very proper way of speaking. No contractions, no sentences that end with a preposition. Everything's very proper, except for the kid.
Right. He's a kid. He's a kid genie, so it's kind of an interesting. I don't know. It's really interesting. If the last genie that I can remember in a movie before this, well, there probably have been some that are like beautiful women, kind of a dream of genie things. But the last proper medical genie that pops into my head is from Thief of Baghdad, the 1940s version. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a marvelous fantasy film by the Cordas, by Alexander Korda, and has great special effects. And the genie in that is this huge, imposing, nearly terrifying character who interacts with Sabu, who's the thief of the Thief of Baghdad. And to go from this huge, imposing character into this one where he's literally a little boy is kind of an interesting contrast and an interesting change. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure exactly why they did that, why the genie is a little boy, although it makes an excellent story point. It's like he's like a surrogate son in some ways to Sinbad and Parissa. And there is a story point that goes along with that, but maybe part of it is also that you don't want to have a really huge genie competing with the giant Cyclops and the dragon and the rock and things like that. So a smaller genie who's nevertheless powerful is maybe a better fit for this kind of movie than a huge, Robin Williams, I am the genie of the lamp.
Right.
Amazing cosmic power. Tiny little house, or whatever it is he said in the film.
Right. Well, and that's something actually I wanted to ask you about. I didn't remember the genie to begin with, but when I saw it, and then I come across the moment in the film where we learn that he's being kept against his will and he really wants his freedom, I couldn't help think of Disney's Aladdin at this point.
Right.
And how much of that was an influence, intentionally or otherwise.
Given how influential this film is in Hollywood, I can't imagine that the people working on Aladdin were not influenced by that idea, even though that's the genie chained to the lamp or the bottle or something is a mythological idea. You're right. The way genie is chained in servitude is very similar to the way the Robin Williams genie is chained in Aladdin.
Which just blew my mind. And again... Yeah. Right.
Well, it's amazing. I mean, I don't know if you were going to mention this later in the film, but there are a lot of things in this film that are really obviously influential to other Hollywood films. You mentioned the skeleton scene right off the top, but there's also the the two heroes swinging across the endless chasm on a rope that is very clearly, directly saluted in Star Wars in the scene in the Death Star with Luke and Leia.
Oh yeah, Lucas saw this film.
Right, absolutely, and all those guys did. If you see interviews with Dennis Muir and the other people at ILM, all of them say Harryhausen's the guy.
Oh yeah, sure, Phil Tippett and all of them. Yeah, definitely.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you saw that. To mention the skeleton sword fight thing. Army of Darkness touched on that a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true. And even similar technique in terms of filming or presenting that on film, was almost a direct, homage or I don't want to say copy, but it's pretty obvious they had spent some time watching these movies to get that look right for Army of Darkness as well.
Right, absolutely. Sam Raimi loves this film, loves Harryhausen work, and it's clearly Army of Darkness is a tribute to this and to the Jason and the Argonauts, which has even more skeletons.
Yeah, kids like the skeletons. Put more of them in. Yeah, which now I want to see Jason and the Argonauts again because I haven't seen that in years either. So.
Oh, it's a great film.
Oh, I bet. Well, eventually this magician manipulates events and manipulates the two rulers and finds a way to get Sinbad to take him back to his little island by shrinking the princess in what I thought was a really neat special effects sequence. It's very subtle. I mean, it's not fancy. We just see her shrink.
Yeah, in kind of a strange way in terms of what you expect because, well, for whatever reason they did it this way, it's actually a much more effective shrinking sequence than you expect for the time, where you simply see her arm lying on her bed, where she's suddenly surrounded by this gaseous mist that the magician has set up, and you see the arm gradually shrinking in relationship to the pillow that she's lying on top of.
Right.
And you don't actually see the outcome, you just see the start of it, and then you see the reactions. And it's actually a scene or two later where you discover that, yes, indeed, she has been shrunken down to the size of, a Barbie doll, actually smaller than a Barbie. I
mean, and you don't know what's happening. Like you said, it's very, you don't know what's going on. Is she withering away? Is she, who knows what's happening here? And then you get the reaction.
Right, we've already seen a woman turn into a half serpent, half woman thing. So there's lots of possibilities that could be going on there. Mm-hmm. But in fact, she's just been shrunk down to doll size.
And then the magician reveals, well, I can fix her if you take me back to my castle on that island.
Right.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, if you give me what I always wanted and been asking for this whole movie, I can solve this problem.
Yep.
No trouble.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Nobody, dude, he's an evil magician. You don't trust, but okay. So,
well, I love the scene where they're mad at him because the caliphs, the two factions, are mad at the magician because they've said, "Can you tell the future? What does the future hold?" And he gives them a bad prophecy. He tells them, "Your two countries are going to be at war." He's in this supposed trance, and they flip out and they decide they're going to kill the messenger.
Right.
And so Sinbad knocks him to the floor, and the caliph goes, "Well done, Sinbad."
Yeah.
You're just beating up. You literally told this guy to tell you what he saw, no matter how bad it was. He tells you a bad thing, and then you hit him.
How dare
That's not great. And tell him you're going to kill him or put his eyes out or something if he's still in the city the time the next sun rolls around.
Right.
So there's this great scene where the magician is actually leaving the city, and they have to actually go and chase him down and try to bring him back, where he's like, "Oh, no, I'm not coming back. They're going to kill me if I come back," to undo what we all know, but they haven't figured out.
Right.
That he has done, that he's shrunk the princess. So they go looking for help to the guy that's caused the problem, and he goes, no, I'm not coming back.
Yep.
And I love that moment. Torrin Thatcher's just wonderful.
Oh, he's great. Well, yeah. and like you said, as an audience member, we're yelling at the screen, guys, you know what's happening here, right? Come on.
It's kind of strange that you bring this magician into your court and suddenly this weird thing happens.
I wonder what happened. Yeah. Who is responsible? Not the magician that just showed up, but something,
Right, yeah. So they kind of have a Jekyll and Hyde with him. It's like they're impressed with him, then they hate him, then they're impressed with him again enough to be back in their good graces. Like,
Right.
oh, we hated you last night. We're going to kill you. Please come back and save us.
Right, exactly. So Sinbad gets him and, his right-hand man and a crew of prisoners, because he can't put a crew together that wants to go to the scary Cyclops Island. And these prisoners are all sentenced to death anyway. They've got nothing to lose. And he gets on a boat with the obviously bad magician, at least obviously bad to us, and the prisoners who clearly have other intentions, and goes out to where nobody can help them if there's a problem.
Right. Well, you got to go to the island of the Cyclops. You got to go to the island of the Cyclops.
You got to go. And there is an attempted mutiny along the way. And
right, yeah, and a wonderful scene right out of the Seven Voyages and the Odyssey, which is the Seven Voyages.
Right.
The Sinbad voyages were inspired by the Odyssey, in which they're nearly driven mad by the sirens, which they call screaming demons or something like that.
Yeah, and again, this is an example. I don't know, did the magician make that happen, or did he just know it was going to happen? It's pretty impressive though. That whole sequence, the way the sound was done, and everybody's clutching their heads. It's a really good moment, and I really was worried at this point. Who's going to make it to the island? Sinbad's bringing this crew with him that probably going to die along the way. Who's going to help him?
Right. I was reading about it, and they at one point thought they were going to have mermaid-like creatures as the sirens, but because of budgetary reasons and whatever, they didn't do it. But the way they ended up shooting it and using sound effects is very, very effective.
Oh, yeah.
For young people, it was probably kind of scary because, as a kid, you don't think, oh, my God, they can't kill Sinbad now.
Right.
You think, Sinbad's in real danger here. He's locked in a cell, and the ship is heading toward the rocks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't help but notice a little bit of what might have gone into the final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark in this as well. The way all the bad guys are kind of clutching their heads and, being affected by these things that you're hearing more of seeing, and just a touch maybe. I don't know if I'm reaching.
I don't think you probably are, because there is some similarity between that sequence with the screaming demons on the island and the end sequence in Raiders of the Lost Ark after they've opened the Ark and all hell breaks loose.
Right. Oh, yeah. When we do finally get to the island, we're back into monster mode. We're going to see the Cyclops. We're going to see the Rock.
Yep, the Rock.
Now,
two-headed Rock.
Yes. Now, I knew what a Rock was because of my D&D background. I played D&D, growing up for years. The Rock is a fictional fantasy beast as well. I mean, this isn't something Harryhausen made up. This was a mythological creature as well, right?
Yeah. The Rock is from the original Sinbad stories.
Right.
Sometimes called the Hruk, R-H-U-K, rather than R-O-C. Yeah, so he created his beast from the mythology. And they talked at one point about having more than one Rock in the scene, but I think for reasons of time and practicality, they decided to make it just one bird. But because it's a Harryhausen film, it doesn't have to be just a bird. It can be a two-headed bird.
Right.
I just think that's way cool.
Sure. No, and, even though it's been in the mythology and in the original Sinbad stories or whatever, it's got that Harryhausen touch, which all the monsters in this do. I mean, the Cyclops has, a horn and, he looks like a giant.
He's kind of a cross between a human and a Cyclops and a centaur. Yeah,
centaur. That's the word I was looking for.
Or a satyr, actually.
A satyr. That's more appropriate, right. And it just, there's this touch, this thing that makes everything feel Harryhausian.
It's hard to describe, but I always think that you can see Harryhausen's personality or maybe his soul in these creatures. It's like in imbuing them with life, you actually kind of get to see a reflection of who he is and his personality and interests. I think he probably refers to that as giving them character in the fact that they're not just monsters. They have some kind of a personality to them as well. So you can see that it's very obvious in the Cyclops, but you can also see it in the Rock as well.
I can definitely see that, and I can imagine that Harryhausen spent a lot of time in front of a mirror watching, making these movements himself and seeing how he would make those movements so that he could transfer the way he moves into something like the Cyclops, especially with something like the Cyclops or something that's obviously humanoid. I could see how he could kind of work his own body English into the monsters he's creating. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think mirrors are definitely part of the process.
Sure.
A thing I didn't mention was when I was in my teenage years and younger, I actually thought I might be an animator. That was one of my goals. And one of the reasons it probably didn't happen was it was an expensive hobby to try to do at the time. You had crappy cameras or you had expensive cameras. And all the things that went into it, the things that Ray overcame to get where he was and learn that technique, were really pretty sizable. This is not a day where you had digital cameras or digital stop motion cameras or anything that you could practice with. I have more capabilities in the little pocket camera that I got upstairs than you could easily muster as even an adult in the 1970s in terms of the technology that you could use to make a film. Back then, it was all film. You had to have film stock. You had to have cameras. If you were using 8mm, you had to flip over the film in between. You had to have, essentially some kind of a dark room to work in just to change the film and all that kind of stuff. And it is a very painstaking process, and it does involve a lot of observation. And one of the things that I realized as I moved from my ambition to do animation into my ambition to do comics was just how much about the way animals move and the way people move and how much anatomy and stuff goes into these creatures that we just take for granted on the screen. And we take them for granted with Harryhausen's films because they're all so well done. If you see someone else doing the animation who's not maybe as good, say the guys that did Jack the Giant Killer, who are very good, but not quite at the same level, you start to see little differences between the way the creatures move and the way people move, or the way the anatomy is in the creatures and the way anatomy is in things you know. And in a Harryhausen movie, you never think about that at all.
Right. It's so transparent. It works so well that you don't start to break it down and be like, well, that's obviously clay here, and this is obviously, you don't have to.
Right.
He doesn't give you the opportunity to because it's so good. And, we were talking about The Rock earlier. The stuff that impresses me the most about what Harryhausen does, and the best stop motion artists out there, are the stop motion creatures that are flying, that do not have to deal with gravity.
Right.
So to say, because you're now dealing with something that is completely freestanding. With the Cyclops, and I'm not belittling it at all, but the Cyclops is at least 1 foot on the ground. There's always a little bit of support there, but you get that thing up in the air, you're dealing with an extra dimension that just it blows my mind every time I see it.
Yeah, and as a young animator without the internet for resources and that kind of stuff, that was one of the things I just could not figure out.
Right. Well, and even now, when you watch the baby rocks being born and pieces of the eggshell are falling off the stop motion cracking egg, they fall as if there is gravity affecting them. There are no wires that you can see.
Right.
How did he do that?
I think the answer is he actually did do it with wires,
sure,
but he did it in such a way that you couldn't detect what he was doing.
Exactly. And
that's just amazing.
And you were talking about the anatomy. That's the other thing I wanted to mention. When we see the dragon later, that's buried underground near the magician's lair, it's breathing. So it's not just a matter of taking a piece of clay and pushing it around this way or that way or whatever. There's something being done here. And I don't know if it was done in bladders. I don't know how it was done. I'd have to do some research or whatever. But you can see its chest and belly expand and contract as it's drawing breath and exhaling. That's mighty impressive.
It is. And that's a technique he actually learned from Willis O'Brien, too, who had done it in The Lost World. And yeah, it does involve a bladder, something like a blood pressure cuff in the thing, which then he animated that as well as everything else that was going on. It wasn't something you could actually just, the way we breathe. He didn't do that in natural time. He did that all in animation, too.
Right. And it was done. It wasn't like a consistent thing, because if it had become just like a regular rhythm, you'd kind of detect it and it would kind of start to stand out. But as the dragon is moving around, as it's lifting a leg, it kind of takes a deeper breath and exhale. It's just very lifelike.
Right. And the thought process that this man had here working alone to do that all by himself and to think, I need to have this creature breathe this way at this point so it will look natural in its breathing and not just, as you say, not just a kind of a regular metronome pump going off. It's just astonishing. The attention to detail. I think I've never met Ray. I'm envious of Vincent and Mary Rotolo who have.
Oh yeah, man! When they did that episode of the B Movie Cast and revealed they had met Ray Harryhausen, my jaw dropped.
Yeah,
I'm like, what?
Oh,
wow.
I'd give probably one of my fingers to do that.
I don't know if they knew it at the time, but they were living for every one of us in that moment.
Absolutely. And in some ways, we see people, sometimes they're called geniuses.
Yeah.
Part of me thinks that, if you were to run Ray through the psychology, maybe he's just a genius, but maybe he has some of that high functioning focus that normal people just do not have.
Yeah, no, I tell you, man, I mean, just producing a podcast, after a couple of hours, I need to walk away. So, I mean, to be able to sit in a lab or a studio somewhere for hours on it.
Hour after hour.
And even before the production begins, because he's got to figure out how to make that work with the blood pressure cuff and the design of it and working with the armatures and building up the monster itself.
Right, and how much he has to inflate it each time to think so that it will look like it's breathing and not like it's gasping or whatever else is happening. Just the amount of forethought and planning, just the attention to detail and the patience that this guy shows in every one of these films you don't see any of that on the screen in some sense, because he does it so well it looks real, or as near to real as film can make it.
And there is a lot of attention to detail to other elements of the film as well. I mean, throughout the rest of the story, it's basically Sinbad and the princess trying to get the magician to reverse the process. We're fighting monsters along the way, and the genie gets free as well in all of this, and ultimately the good guys win. But when we're up in the magician's laboratory, his lair, I mean, there is a lot of detail just to the production design and the props. Although there was one that kind of threw me off a little bit. There's a fight between Sinbad and the skeleton, and Sinbad disarms the skeleton, not literally, but I mean, just but he knocks the sword away, so the skeleton throws a shield at him instead. Sinbad ducks, and the shield hits the wall behind him. Mounted on the magician's wall is a stuffed alligator or crocodile. Where did that come from? On this little Arabian island? What?
Could have come from the Nile, but he's a magician, right? So it's eye of newt, wing of bat, foot of crocodile.
Yeah, oh, there you go. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
I never really noticed that.
I don't know why
all the times I've seen this. It's funny, you can watch a film like this, and because of the dedication that people put into it, you really can almost see something new every time that you watch it. Mm-hmm. For instance, one of the last two times I watched it, I noticed that second Cyclops, there are two Cyclopses on the island, or Cyclopes on the island. There's the one they meet initially that then puts them in a cage and tries to roast them, and they have this epic battle with it. And after that one is killed, there's another one that comes out and fights the dragon later in the film. Wonderful. Another one of these wonderful battles that if you were of the same age I am, you could get it on 8mm film from the back of the famous Monsters of Filmland catalog. But that second Cyclops actually has two horns on his head. The first one only has one. And I didn't notice this for decades watching this film. And only one of the last times I saw it did I go, wait a minute. That's not the same Cyclops as the previous one. That's actually literally a different one. Because I always just thought that they were the same and all Cyclopes looked alike. But they don't. And there's that little attention to detail that if you're paying attention, it's like, wait a minute, there really are, they implied there were more than one Cyclops on the island. But there you actually get to see another one that's not just the same model redressed, it's a different model.
I hadn't noticed that even just this morning. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch it.
Right. Well, like I said, I've gone 30, 40 years and never noticed it until within the last year. I was like, wow, I never noticed that before.
All right, big thanks to Steve for taking some time to talk to us about this movie, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. I am so glad he picked it. I've mentioned this a couple of times. I've put the call out to pick classic monster movies to talk about here on the show, and I kind of assumed that people would go to the Universals. I kind of assumed people would go to monster horror movies. I've had so many people wanting to do these sci-fi movies. I think it's great, and big thanks to everybody who has decided to pick those types of movies for us to cover here on the show, because I think it really shows and demonstrates the breadth and depth of what it really means to be a fan of these movies. I mean, it's not just, a guy who sits around watching the Universal movies over and over and over again. These monster kids, us monster kids, enjoy the sci-fi movies as well. And I'm going to talk about a sci-fi movie that I just recently watched on the next episode of Monster Kid Radio that'll be coming out in 2 days, so stay tuned for episode 10 for the rest of the conversation with Stephen D. Sullivan. We're not going to make it this week, but if you're in the Portland, Oregon area, you will be hard-pressed to find something better to do with your time than to go to the Joy Cinema in Tigard. They're over at 11959 Southwest Pacific Highway in Tigard. You can find their website at thejoycinema.com. Their Weird Wednesday series is continuing. On July 26th, you're going to see the movie The Acid Eaters from 1968. Now, this is less a horror movie and more just something really weird. I don't know anything about it, actually, and I asked Jeff at the Joy Cinema about it, and he told me it's just a really weird, trippy movie, and probably one that'll be a lot of fun to watch with a group of people. According to the Internet Movie Database, it is about a group of office workers going every Friday afternoon to the White Pyramid, which is a 50-foot tower of LSD. So this seems less monster and more just out there, but the movie is free. Weird Wednesday is free. It's for 21 and over only. All you got to pay for is whatever concessions you want to have while you watch this movie. And he's got the traditional, the popcorn, the candy, the soda. He's also got beer, pizza, and nachos. So again, head over to thejoycinema.com to see what's coming up next. And as I mentioned last week, July 3rd, EGA. That is a Monster Kid Radio Crash event. Monster Kid Radio crashes EGA on July 3rd at the Joy Cinema. I can't wait. That's going to be a lot of fun to see on the big screen with a group of like-minded folks. Hear some awesome music, watch some awesome performance. It's a fun movie. If you've not seen EGA, then I highly recommend you guys check that out. And then on July 10th is Guess What Happened to Count Dracula? I don't know what's coming up next. I hope to find out soon, and I'll let you guys know. Monster Kid Radio is a registered service mark of Monster Kid Radio LLC. All original content of Monster Kid Radio by Monster Kid Radio LLC is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivations 3.0 Unported license. That does not apply, however, to the song Hearse Surfin' from the album She Left Her Brain at the Drive-In, which appears courtesy of the band The Phantomatics. See you in a couple of days.